Welcome to Reflections on Identity, a podcast series exploring educators' narratives on their professional identity. Today, Neil and I are wrapping up the series and just having a brief conversation about what we've learned from these interviews. So I'm going to start by handing over to Neil. What's the biggest thing that comes out of this for you?
I think the thing that I was expecting, and I think did come out of the series, Carol, was the importance of context. We deliberately chose, didn't we, a variety of contexts that we couldn't include in the book, the original book, just because of, restrictions around how many people you can expect to write chapters and have the time and space to do that. So I think you and I very consciously gravitate to this podcast series because of the flexibility enabled us to sort of invite people on from different areas. And I hope what the listeners have got is a sense of the sheer variety of contexts in which education and professional identity align with one another and how people interpret those. And it's the context to me that seems to be critical. I don't know if you felt that in the sense that, the day-to-day engagements that people had with the people they worked with, the work that they did, the level of collaboration or autonomy that they had, the locations, whether they were static or whether they were sort of peripatetic or people moving around, all of these kinds of things, subject allegiance, disciplinary allegiance, the phase that they were working in, all of these areas seem to be absolutely critical to the way that the people on the podcast envisaged themselves and who they were and how they worked. I mean, what was your sort of take from there?
Yeah, I would say very similar to that. Context was a really big factor. And when I'm listening through them again, I was picking up similarities in terms of how people view their professional identity linked to the sort of context that they were working in. One of the things we've discussed in the past is the influence of external factors. So where people were working in environments like schools, certainly primary and secondary schools, where you had external factors like Ofsted influencing, that made a significant difference to how people could interpret their identity. And we were saying one of the people that we interviewed actually even brought up this idea that one influences the other, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Because you had said previously that we are drawn to certain roles for certain reasons. So our own personal identity might influence the roles we choose, but then the role will influence how we develop a professional identity. So it's a dynamic, definitely.
And I mean, you made a very pertinent observation around when you've been listening to the episodes sort of in a concentrated form, Carol, about these kind of keywords that are emerging. Do you want to say a little bit about those and what you've kind of drawn from those in any way?
Yeah, definitely. And that was it wasn't something I'd set out to do, actually. It was just, as I was listening through them and just making a few notes to remind myself about each of the interviews, these keywords just popped into my head about the different interviews. And again, you could link that back to the context, but it was words like values came out in terms of how that had influenced identity, ethics and beliefs. But for other people, it was about how they juggled. When for example, William's interview talks about his own professional and personal development, but how he juggles several things as a counsellor, as a university lecturer, and how he's trying not to let one influence the other. And of course, a lot of people are doing those sorts of things. So for me, that's an activity to continue. I want to see if I could highlight a key word for each of those interviews, what would it be? Mm-hmm. And I'm not sure what it would be for me either. If I was highlighting a keyword about what influences my identity, I'm not sure what I would say if somebody asked me that in an interview. I know what I would like to say. What I would actually say might be a different story.
I suppose with me, I've always, when I look back on my own educational career, I've tended to work outside of the locality. So, I mean, I started off primarily as an adult educator in sort of what was called Skills for Life under the Blair government, and a lot of that was off site. So because we were kind of working with employers and community and charity and union providers and what have you, a lot of that was off site. And then from there, I gravitated towards teacher training and teacher education, which again, as you know as well, a lot of that just from the observations and the visit side of things was off site. And then even coming into HE, I've worked in multiple locations. So there must be something about my identity that requires me to, I don't know if keeping an arm's length from the centre is important. I'm not absolutely conscious of that always, but there must be something in me that makes me want to do or gravitate towards work where I'm sort of not necessarily at the hub of things. Perhaps I want that distance or that space. I don't know. I mean, what's your sort of take on your identity like that, do you think?
I think that peripatetic, that whole thing is does make a big difference. And interestingly, this is similar. I think it was some research we did together. This came out in terms of how much agency people felt they had, and people tended to feel they had a lot more agency in their roles when they were in the satellite centres, when they weren't working at a main hub for an organisation, but also the people who went around and visited different centres. So I can see why you would be drawn to that setting, and I'm always drawn to smaller places. I don't like being, and I wonder if it's for that reason. Because, I'm not great with rules, and
I don't know. I know what you mean.
Make up my own mind about things, but I think you do have a lot more freedom, don't you?
I think you value independence. I think. I mean, we've known each other long enough where I think we both value independence. I think the trade-off is, of course, because you're not at the centre of things, you're not at the centre of things. If that makes sense, and that's the trade-off, isn't it? I mean, so I suppose I've felt sometimes slightly removed, or have chosen to remove myself from the day-to-day sort of workings of institutions because of that. Maybe because I'm slightly suspicious of institutions. Maybe there's a sort of a psychological thing going on there for me that makes that important.
Yeah, and that's drawing us back to that same point, actually. It's brought us nicely back to this point about it being a dynamic, isn't it? So things about our role influence our professional identity, but factors about our identity influence the roles we choose and the settings that we choose to work in. So it is difficult separating the two. I think maybe for me, that's been the biggest learning from this whole thing, that there is still a very big connection between role and identity.
I mean, the other thing I was going to ask you, I don't know if this is easy to answer or not, but we started this whole project, 4 or 5 years ago, with the book, with the premise that we didn't think that educationalists had as strong a sense of professional identity as other professions. And I suppose the classic ones are things like law and medicine, aren't they? Do you still feel, having done the book and the podcast series, that's still the case for you or not?
It'd be interesting to see how much we differ on this. For me, yes, it is, because there's been such a variety. So I'm not a lawyer or a doctor, so I can't really say what being in that would feel like and how I would identify. But my understanding of it from the people I know in those roles is they have a very strong and similar professional identity. I think within education, the roles are so different and the contexts are so different. I think so are the identities. And maybe it's that's the factor, not that teachers or education leaders don't have a strong professional identity. It's just that they work in very different settings. What about you?
My feeling is it's probably a bit more fragile and a bit more vulnerable to the sways of policy and intervention, I think, than perhaps other organisations and other professions have. I mean, it's quite interesting. So, I mean, some of the research you've done over the years is that a lot of when you talk to senior leaders, particularly, is that a lot of people in education don't feel they have as much autonomy as the leaders who they're working with think they have. Now, whether that's something that is prevalent in these other professions as well, certainly they've made, historically, those professions have made a big play about independence and autonomy, haven't they? And that,
Yeah.
they need to be, that needs to be respected. I'm still not completely sure, Carol, that although the individuals themselves might have a strong sense of identity, because identity is social as much as personal or individual, I'm not sure there's a strong sense of that level of professional autonomy, independence that reinforces identity in education than it has for some of these other traditional professions, if you like. And that's a controversial point. I mean, I'm happy for people to push back on that. I just think, you know, the people we've talked to, the things we've read and the discussions we've had, I'm just not sure it's as stable or has got as much strength in terms of dealing with and pushing back when it's under pressure from other stakeholders, particularly government.
Yeah, I'd agree. I'd agree, and I think there is still that sense of, I don't want to use the term underdog, but it's kind of, there is that sense of not feeling able to push back. So I suppose my next question is, what do we do about that?
Well, I suppose that's where organisations like the Chartered College of Teaching previously and other professional associations have tried to do that, haven't they? With varying degrees of success. I mean, I suppose I would say probably it has to be a collaborative effort at some level, doesn't there? And there probably already are. I mean, well, we know there are. And whether it's, you know, professional associations or the teaching unions, or as we said, the Chartered College and other bodies, I'm sure there are people. Well, you said, you know, when we were talking to, you know, James, you know, there are bodies out there that are pushing for this, and I suspect that has to continue, doesn't it? And it's going to be a slow, incremental process, Carol. I mean, I dare say teachers are held in higher esteem now than they might have been 60, 70 years ago, perhaps, and 60, 70 years from now, you would hope they'll be held in higher esteem again. But I think it's got to be collaborative, hasn't it? Ultimately, that there's got to be some structural effort within the profession to push for that greater respect from, you know, stakeholders, be they parents, government, the inspectorate, the business community, you know, religious groups, whomever. I don't know what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, I'd agree. I mean, it's like all things, there's never one simple answer, is there? But it would be interesting to talk to those organisations. I think we've had the chance to talk to you, Seth, but it would be interesting to talk to people like the Chartered College and the Society for Education and Training and those sorts of institutions, just to see what their ideas are about it and how successful those programmes have been in raising professional identity, like things like the chartered teacher status and all of that, all of those things. So maybe next steps.
Maybe next steps.
That's what we think about next.
Any last thoughts you want the listeners to sort of take away from the series? Is there any sort of last words or last reflections?
I think we've reflected on this. It would be really interesting to see other people's thoughts on this, you know, comments on if they've listened to a particular episode and it's made them think. So I suppose for me, the reflections are, I hope that it has given a bit of food for thought. I don't think we've produced any answers, but then I don't know that was necessarily the aim of it. It was really to start. I think one of the things we said in the introduction, wasn't it? It was to start a conversation exactly as the book was. So I hope that we've done that and we've got people talking about it. What about
Yeah, I
you?
mean, I'd agree completely. I think it's all about dialogue, and there's no beginning and no end to that. And as long as people in the profession, in our area of work, see it as important, I think it's something to continue having that conversation about. And I hope we've made some contribution to that, both in the book and the podcast, to stimulate people to, have that space to question and reflect. And I think that, when we've spoken to people, they've appreciated that opportunity that we've had with them to actually think about how they work and what the work that they do and the importance they attach to it and the importance other people attach to it, and that space is important.
Yeah, yeah, I agree. So I think for one very last time, I will say you have been listening to Reflections on Identity. We won't be continuing with another episode, but feel free to leave your comments and let us know your thoughts overall.
Yeah, I mean, thanks for listening, everybody, and it's been a pleasure working with those that we worked with, and thank you, everybody who's taken the time to listen to the series, and hope you've got something from it. So a big thank you to everybody.